The wedding candles were still burning when Clara heard her husband ask another woman to stay. She had not meant to hear it. She had come back down the corridor because she had forgotten her shawl, the thin wool one her mother had left her, the only thing she still owned that smelled faintly of home. And the door to the great hall side chamber had been left open just enough for voices to slip through. Just enough to destroy everything. "She will never know," Edmund said. "She does not have the instinct for it. She cannot even feel the bond." A woman's low laugh, warm, familiar. "You married her anyway." "I married her land." A pause, and the sound of something being set down, a cup, perhaps, against stone. "The Coldmere Valley passes to me the moment she signs the inheritance scroll. It will take another fortnight, perhaps less. After that, it no longer matters what she knows." Clara stood in the corridor and did not breathe. The candle she carried trembled in her hand. The flame bent sideways, as if the castle itself had exhaled. She pressed her back against the cold stone wall and told herself she had misheard. That the words had been rearranged by exhaustion, by the strange heaviness that had settled into her bones since the ceremony that morning. She had been unwell for weeks, a slow, persistent fatigue that the healer had attributed to nerves, to the strain of travel, to the change of season. Clara had believed it, because she had wanted to believe it. She had wanted to believe many things about Edmund Voss. She had believed he was kind because he was quiet. She had believed he was patient because he never raised his voice. She had believed the marriage was real because she had needed it to be. 23 years old, without a father, without a pack, without a wolf of her own. An Omega who had never presented her inner animal, who carried the bloodline of a noble house now crumbled to debt and memory. She had arrived at Voss Keep 3 months ago with 2 trunks and a letter of introduction, and the fragile hope that this arrangement might become something softer over time, that she might earn a place here, that she might stop feeling like a thing being moved from one hand to another. She had been foolish. She understood that now, standing in the corridor with her mother's shawl clutched against her chest, listening to the man she had married 6 hours ago discuss the timeline of her usefulness. The woman inside the chamber spoke again. "And if she refuses to sign, she will not refuse." Edmund's voice carried a certainty that made Clara's stomach turn. "She is Omega. She has no Alpha command, no wolf, no allies within a fortnight's ride. She has nowhere to go, Seren. She will do as she is told because she has no other choice." Seren. Clara knew that name. Edmund's childhood companion. The beta woman who had smiled at Clara during the wedding feast with eyes that gave nothing away. Clara had thought her reserved. She understood now what that restraint had been concealing. She made herself move before her legs could stop working entirely. Back down the corridor, around the turn, up the stairs, 2 at a time, her bare feet silent on the cold stone. The wedding slippers had been removed hours ago. They had pinched, and she had been too tired to care about appearances by evening. Now she was grateful for the silence of her own footsteps as she climbed to the chamber that had been prepared for her, the one she had not yet shared with Edmund, the one that smelled of fresh rushes and beeswax, and a faint undertone of something medicinal she had not thought to question until now. She stopped at the door. The herbalist's bundle on the bedside table. She had assumed it was for sleep. Lavender and valerian, a common enough remedy for nerves. She crossed the room in 3 steps and lifted it to her face. Lavender, valerian, and beneath both of those, something sharper, something she did not recognize, acrid and faint and wrong in a way she could not name but her body already knew, because her hands had begun to shake before her mind caught up. Whatever she has been given, it has been given slowly. She did not know enough about herbs to be certain, but she knew enough about the heaviness in her limbs, the fog that had been gathering at the edges of her thoughts for weeks, the morning she had woken feeling as though she had been pressed into the bed by something invisible. She had called it grief. She had called it anxiety. She had called it the adjustment of a woman entering a new household. She set the bundle down with great care, as if it might break, as if she might break, and then she sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself precisely 3 breaths of something that was not yet panic. He married me for the land. The Coldmere Valley, her father's last holding, passed to her upon his death, and now, by law, to her husband upon their union, unless she had not yet signed the inheritance scroll. She had not signed it. The council steward had mentioned it would be presented within the fortnight, a formality, nothing urgent. She had nodded and forgotten about it entirely. She would not sign it, and she would not be here when they came to ask her. Clara rose from the bed. She moved without allowing herself to feel the full weight of what she was doing, because if she allowed herself to feel it, she would sit back down and weep, and she could not afford that. She opened the smaller of her 2 trunks, the one she had packed herself, the one Edmund's servants had not touched, and pulled out a linen underdress, heavier wool stockings, her riding cloak. She dressed in the dark. She braided her pale hair quickly, not neatly, just enough to keep it from her face. She took her mother's shawl. She took the small leather purse at the bottom of the trunk, the one that held the last of her father's coin. Not much, but enough to buy a night's lodging at an inn. Perhaps 2, if she was careful. She did not take the wedding ring. She left it on the bedside table beside the poisoned herbs, and did not look back at it. The servant's stair was at the far end of the corridor, narrow and unguarded at this hour. She had learned the layout of Voss Keep in her first weeks here, not because she had suspected anything, but because it was her nature to learn the shape of places she lived in, to know where the exits were. She had thought of it as a comfort, a small private habit. Now it was saving her life. The night outside was cold. Early autumn had not yet stripped the trees entirely, and the forest that pressed against the eastern wall of the keep was dark, in a way that felt alive. She had no mount. The stables were too close to the guardhouse, too much risk. She would go on foot, east, toward the old merchant road that cut through Coldmere territory toward the border of the Ashvale lands. If she could reach the road before dawn, she could find a traveling party, a carter, anyone moving in the right direction. She was 300 paces from the keep's eastern gate when the ground tilted. It happened without warning. One moment she was walking, her cloak pulled tight against the chill, her breath fogging in the darkness. The next, the world listed sideways, and her knees stopped working. She caught herself against the trunk of an oak, bark rough against her palms, and pressed her forehead to the wood, and waited for it to pass. It did not pass. Whatever had been in the herbs had been accumulating for weeks. And now, with her heart pounding hard, and her body pushed past the careful numbness of the evening, it announced itself fully. Her vision blurred at the edges. Her legs were distant things, belonging to someone else. She thought, with a clarity that seemed almost absurd given the circumstances, that she was going to lose consciousness in the forest outside her husband's keep on her wedding night, and that when they found her in the morning, Edmund would say she had wandered out in a fever and feel absolutely nothing about it. She pushed off from the oak. 1 step, 2, 3. The road was still far. The forest was dark in every direction. She was barefoot again. She could not remember when the slippers had come off this time. The ground was damp and cold, and covered in fallen leaves that stuck to her skin. She made it perhaps another 50 paces before her body decided it had done enough. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was the forest canopy overhead, branches black against a sky full of cold, indifferent stars, and the thought that moved through her, strange and small and almost peaceful, was that she hoped someone would find her before Edmund did. Someone. Anyone. Anyone else. She woke to the smell of wood smoke and pine resin, and something warm beneath her cheek that was not the forest floor. Clara kept her eyes closed for a long moment, cataloging sensations before she trusted herself to move. She was lying on something firm but not hard, a bedroll perhaps, or a folded blanket over packed earth. There was a fire nearby. She could hear it, a low and steady crackle, and its warmth reached her face in slow, even waves. Her feet were no longer bare. Someone had wrapped them in cloth. Her cloak was still around her shoulders, but something heavier had been added over it. Wool, dense and dark, smelling of leather and cold air, and a scent beneath both of those that she could not name, but that made some animal part of her go very still. Not afraid, just still. Alert in a way she had not been in weeks. She opened her eyes. The fire was built low and careful in a clearing she did not recognize, ringed with stones in the manner of a hunter's camp. The trees here were older than the ones near Voss Keep, their trunks wide and dark, their roots surfacing from the earth like the backs of sleeping creatures. Overhead, the sky had shifted from black to the deep gray of very early morning. She had been unconscious for hours then. "You are awake." The voice came from her right. Not close, perhaps 10 feet away at the edge of the firelight. But it filled the clearing without effort, the way a bell fills a room. Low, unhurried. The voice of someone who had never needed to raise it to be heard. She turned her head. He was sitting with his back against an oak, one knee raised, forearm resting across it in a posture of such complete ease that it should have looked careless. It did not. Nothing about him looked careless. He was large in a way that reorganized the space around him, broad through the shoulders, the kind of build that came from years of actual use rather than display. His hair was black and long, pulled back in many narrow braids that fell forward over one shoulder, and his eyes, watching her across the fire, were the pale blue of winter ice, clear and very direct, and giving almost nothing away. He wore dark leather, cross-strapped at the chest, a heavy manto of black fur pushed back from his shoulders. No sigil that she could see, no crown. But there was something about the quality of his stillness, the particular way he occupied space, that told her without any words that this was not a man accustomed to being questioned. Clara sat up slowly. Her head swam, but less than before. She pulled the extra covering, his cloak, she realized, unmistakably his, tighter across her shoulders without thinking, and then realized what she had done, and made herself release it. "Who are you?" Her voice came out steadier than she had expected. Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile, exactly. An acknowledgement. "Tristan." Just the name. Nothing attached to it. She filed that away. "You found me in the forest." "My outriders found you. I came when they reported a woman unconscious and alone 300 paces from Voss Keep on her wedding night." He said it without inflection, but his eyes moved over her face with a precision that made her feel examined in a way she was not accustomed to. "You are Clara Voss. I was Clara Ashford." The correction came before she could stop it. "I signed nothing tonight." A brief pause. "I know." She looked at him more carefully. "How?" "Because I have been watching Edmund Voss for 6 months." He shifted, unfolding from his position against the tree with a fluid economy of movement that spoke of long physical discipline, and crouched at the edge of the fire to add a branch to it. The flames rose briefly, throwing more light across his features. The small scar at the corner of his jaw, the unhurried certainty of his hands. "He has been acquiring territory through marriage contracts for 3 years. 3 Omega women before you. None of them retained their holdings afterward." The cold that moved through Clara then had nothing to do with the night air. What happened to them? He looked at her across the fire. His expression was careful, and she understood from that carefulness alone what the answer was. She pressed her fingers against the ground. Damp earth and old leaves, real and present. She focused on the texture of it and breathed. "He would have waited until after I signed," she said, half to herself. "He said a fortnight. He needed the scroll witnessed by the council. Yes. Then I was not supposed to hear that conversation tonight. No. She thought about the herbs on the bedside table. The weeks of fog, the heaviness she had mistaken for grief. She thought about Edmund's careful patience during their courtship, the way he had never pressed her, never rushed her, never once made her feel in danger. She had thought that was his character. She understood now it was a strategy. Keep the Omega calm. Keep her compliant. Keep her slowly, carefully unwell, so that when the moment came, she would not have the strength to resist. You said you have been watching him for 6 months. She looked up at Tristan. Why? He was quiet for a moment, in a way that felt deliberate rather than evasive. Because what he does to Omega women is a violation of the old law, and because the third woman before you was the younger sister of a man who serves under my command. Something moved across his features, brief, controlled. She did not survive the winter after her marriage to Voss. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the dark forest, an owl called once and fell silent. Clara absorbed this. She thought about the woman, the unknown woman, someone's sister, someone who had perhaps also arrived at Voss Keep with 2 trunks and a letter of introduction and a fragile, foolish hope. She felt grief for her that was clean and sharp and entirely separate from her own fear. You still have not told me who you are, she said. Not really. He met her gaze. I am the Alpha King of the Ashvale territories. The keep you were trying to reach is 3 days east of here. The Ashvale territories. She knew the name the way everyone in the northern kingdoms knew it, as a fact of geography, a border on a map, a name spoken in councils with a particular combination of respect and caution. The Alpha King of Ashvale did not involve himself in the affairs of lesser houses. He did not sit at other men's wedding feasts, or send envoys to negotiate petty inheritance disputes. He ruled the largest and oldest wolf territory in the northern reaches, and the stories told about him were the kind that made lesser alphas straighten their spines when his name was mentioned. She was sitting wrapped in his cloak beside his fire. Why did you come personally? She asked. You said your outriders found me. You could have sent them back with me. I could have. He did not look away. I did not. She did not know what to do with that. She filed it away alongside the name, alongside the careful way he had answered her questions, alongside the fact that a man of his status had sat awake beside a stranger's fire, until she regained consciousness and had not once given her reason to be afraid. She was not afraid of him. That, she realized, was the strangest part. After everything the night had given her, the cruelty of Edmund's voice through a half-open door, the cold of the forest floor, the terrifying dissolution of her own legs beneath her. She was sitting across from the most powerful alpha in the northern reaches, and she was not afraid. She was exhausted. She was furious in a way that had not yet fully surfaced. She was grieving something she was not ready to name, but she was not afraid of him, and she did not understand that about herself. I need to send word to the Royal Council, she said. Edmund will report me missing by morning. He will frame it as illness, as instability. He will use my Omega status to discredit anything I say. She heard the flatness in her own voice, and recognized it as the sound she made when she was holding herself together by method rather than feeling. I need someone who carries more legal authority than he does to testify to what he has done. Tristan looked at her for a long moment. In the firelight, his pale eyes were unreadable, but there was something in his expression that she thought might be, not surprise exactly, more like recognition. You are planning your legal case, he said, while sitting barefoot in a forest, several hours after being poisoned. I am planning my legal case, she confirmed, because if I stop moving forward, I will fall apart, and I cannot afford to fall apart yet. Something in his face changed then. A small, almost imperceptible shift, as though a door had opened slightly in a room that had been sealed for a long time. He looked at her across the fire, and she had the strange and entirely irrational sense that he was seeing her very clearly, and that what he saw did not disappoint him. "My camp is a quarter-mile north," he said. "You will sleep properly tonight and eat, and let my healer assess whatever Voss gave you. In the morning, we will talk about the council." He paused. "You have my word that you will be safe." Clara looked at him. She thought about all the reasons she should not trust those words. She thought about Edmund's patience, which had looked like kindness for 3 months, and she thought about how easily she had believed it. Then she thought about the way this man had not moved closer to her. The way he had kept the fire between them, had given her his cloak without asking for acknowledgement, had answered her questions without deflecting. The way he had said, "You have my word," as though it were a thing with weight, a thing he did not say without meaning. She rose to her feet, her legs held. "Lead the way," she said. The healer's name was Marin, and she had the brisk, unsentimental manner of someone who had spent decades treating wounds that people tried to minimize. She took one look at Clara in the firelight of the camp, a proper camp, with canvas shelters and tethered horses, and the quiet, disciplined movement of soldiers who knew their roles, and clicked her tongue in a way that managed to convey both competence and disapproval without a single word. She guided Clara into a low tent warmed by a brazier of coals, sat her on a folded blanket, and began her assessment with practiced hands and very direct questions. "How long have you been taking the herbs?" "I did not know I was taking anything." Clara kept her voice level. "They were left in my chamber. I assumed they were for sleep." Marin's expression did not change, but something sharpened in her eyes. She lifted Clara's wrist, pressed 2 fingers to the inside of it, and was quiet for a long moment. "At least 5 weeks, I would estimate, based on what I can feel. Slow accumulation. Nothing that would have killed you outright. That was never the design." She set Clara's wrist down with a gentleness that contradicted her brusque manner. "The design was to keep you manageable, compliant, too tired to resist, too foggy to think clearly. A very old recipe, and a very cowardly one. Can you clear it?" "I already have something on the coals." She nodded toward a small iron pot suspended above the brazier, from which rose a thin steam that smelled of yarrow and something bitter Clara could not identify. "You will drink this tonight, and again at dawn. You will feel worse before you feel better. Your body will need to push the residue out. But within 2 days you should have your full clarity back." She paused, studying Clara's face with frank assessment. "You have been functioning through it better than most would. That is either remarkable constitution or remarkable stubbornness." "Probably both," Clara said. For the first time, Marin almost smiled. She was given a bowl of broth afterward, plain and hot, and a heel of bread, and a dry pair of wool stockings that were several sizes too large and did not belong to anyone who would admit to owning them. She ate alone in the tent, methodically, because her body needed it, and because the act of doing something ordinary helped her hold the shape of herself together. Outside she could hear the low voices of soldiers, the shifting of horses, the particular cadence of a well-run camp at the edge of night. She thought about Edmund. She thought about him waking in the morning to find her gone, and the calculation that would immediately replace whatever he felt, if he felt anything at all. He would send riders. He would tell a story. She was unstable. She was unwell. She had wandered off in a fever. She was an omega without a wolf and without reliable judgment, and he was deeply, publicly concerned. He had 3 years of practice constructing these narratives. He was very good at it. She thought about the woman who had been someone's sister. She thought about the other 2 before her, whose names she did not know, but whose stories now lived in her chest like stones. She set the empty bowl down and pressed her hands flat against her thighs and let the anger come properly for the first time. Not the cold, Functional anger she had used to get herself out of the keep and plan her legal arguments across a campfire. The real kind. The kind that burned low and steady and did not require an outlet immediately, only acknowledgement. She acknowledged it. She let it exist. She did not cry, not because she was too strong for it, but because she was too angry, and the anger was more useful right now, and she intended to use it. When Tristan appeared at the tent entrance, he stopped before crossing the threshold and waited until she looked up. "May I come in?" The question surprised her more than his presence had. She nodded. He ducked through the low entrance and settled on the ground across from her, resting his forearms on his knees, making himself smaller than he was in the deliberate way she was beginning to recognize as habit. He brought a folded piece of parchment with him, which he set on the ground between them without comment. "Marin's assessment?" he asked. 5 weeks of slow poisoning, 2 days to clear. She watched him absorb this. "She said it was designed to keep me manageable." Something moved across his face, a tightening around the jaw, quickly controlled. "Yes, that matches what we found with the others." He glanced at the parchment. "This is a sworn deposition from my commander, Aldrich. He gave his testimony before the Northern Council 6 months ago regarding his sister Isolde's death following her marriage to Edmund Voss. The council recorded it and did nothing." A pause. "Voss has allies on that council, 2 lords and a high steward who benefit from his territorial acquisitions." Clara looked at the parchment. "So the legal path has already been attempted." "Through the Northern Council, yes. There is another path." His pale eyes met hers steadily. "The High Crown Council sits in 3 weeks' time at Carath. It supersedes any regional body. If you present your testimony there, a living witness, with evidence of poisoning, with Aldrich's deposition, and my corroboration, Voss cannot suppress it. The High Crown Council answers to no regional lord." 3 weeks, she said. "You would need to travel to Cairath. It is 12 days' ride from here." He paused. "I am traveling to Cairath in 4 days' time. The journey would be safer made together." Clara studied him. In the low light of the brazier, his features were all shadow and sharp angle, the blue of his eyes muted to something darker. She thought about what it meant that the Alpha King of Ashvale was traveling to the High Crown Council, and what it said about the weight of what he was offering. Not just escort, but his public association with her case. His name attached to hers. In the political language of the Northern Kingdoms, that was not a small thing. "Why?" she asked. The same question she had asked him at the fire, and she wanted to see if the answer would be different this time. He was quiet for a moment. Not evasive. She was beginning to be able to tell the difference. He was a man who thought before he spoke, and she had already come to prefer that to the alternative. "Because what Voss does is wrong," he said. "And because Aldrich has carried the weight of his sister's death for 2 years without justice, and he deserves to see it end." He paused once more, and when he continued his voice was the same, level, unhurried. But something underneath it had shifted slightly. "And because you walked out of that keep alone, barefoot, poisoned, on your wedding night, and made it 300 paces before your body stopped you. And you woke up in a stranger's camp, and your first instinct was to plan your legal case." He looked at her directly. "I find that I want to see what you do with 2 days of proper sleep and Marin's remedy." Clara looked at him for a long moment. She was aware of the warmth of the brazier and the bitter steam of Marin's remedy and the oversized wool stockings on her feet and the ridiculous, impossible fact that this night existed at all. That she had gone from wedding candles to poisoned herbs to a forest floor to this, to a man who looked at her like she was worth watching and offered her the High Crown Council as though it were a reasonable thing to hand a woman he had known for 3 hours. "I want something in return," she said. He waited. "Aldrich's commander position. I want him present at Carath. His testimony in person, not just the deposition." And I want access to whatever evidence your investigation has gathered on Voss over the past 6 months. Names, transactions, the land records, all of it. She held his gaze. I will not walk into that council room with only my own word. I will walk in with everything. Something in his face shifted again. That door, opening a little further. Done, he said without hesitation. She nodded. She picked up Myron's remedy from where the healer had left it cooling beside the brazier, and she drank it without flinching, even though it tasted like boiled bark and regret. Tristan watched her do this. He did not comment on the face she made. There is a matter I have not yet raised, he said after a moment. And I raise it now because you deserve to know it, not because it changes anything about the practical arrangement. She set the cup down. Tell me. When my outriders brought me to you in the forest, he stopped, chose his next words with the particular care of a man who had learned not to say things he did not mean. When I approached you, my wolf recognized you. His eyes stayed steady on hers. I recognized you. The words landed in the quiet tent, and Clara felt them the way she felt the warmth of the brazier, not with her skin, but deeper, somewhere she did not have a name for. She had no wolf. She had never shifted, had never felt the inner animal that other pack members described as a second self, a companion, a voice. She was Omega in the truest and loneliest sense, a woman who carried the rank without the gift. She had been told since childhood that this made her less, that the absence of her wolf meant she was incomplete. But something in her chest had gone very still when she first opened her eyes and saw him across the fire. She had noticed it and set it aside, filed it under the category of irrational and inconvenient, and she was not ready to move it to any other category yet. I heard what you said, she told him, keeping her voice careful and even. I am not ready to talk about it. I know. He rose from the ground in one smooth motion and moved toward the tent entrance. And she noticed that he did not push further, did not add anything to soften or retract or explain. He simply accepted her answer and left space around it. Sleep. Marin will come at dawn with the second dose. We break camp mid-morning. He paused at the entrance. You are safe here, Clara. She believed him. That was the part that frightened her most. The ride to Caerath took 11 days. Clara had expected to feel like a guest under guard, tolerated, managed, moved from one place to another like a piece in someone else's game. She had been moved like that before, and she knew the particular texture of it. The careful politeness that meant you do not matter enough to be honest with. The way people talked around her rather than to her. The small courtesies that were actually forms of dismissal. This was not that. On the second morning, when she woke clear-headed for the first time in weeks, Marin's remedy having done its work with uncomfortable efficiency overnight, Aldrich introduced himself outside her tent. He was a broad, weathered man in his late 30s, with a soldier's posture and a grief in his eyes that he did not bother to conceal from her. He said simply that he was glad she was alive, and that his sister's name had been Isolde, and that she had been 26 years old, and had loved horses, and argued with everyone she met, and deserved far better than what had been done to her. He said it the way a man says something he has needed to say for a long time, to someone he thinks might understand. Clara listened to all of it. She said Isolde's name back to him when he was done, deliberately, so that it had been spoken aloud by someone other than himself. She saw what that did to him, and she filed it away not as strategy, but as something that mattered. After that, Aldrich rode near her in the column without being asked. He answered her questions about the evidence, the land records, the transaction documents, the testimonies of Voss's former servants who had been too frightened to come forward to the Northern Council, but had spoken privately to Aldrich's investigators. There was more than she had expected. There was enough. She spent the evenings by the campfire going through it, piece by piece, building the shape of what she would say at Caerath. Tristan's men gave her space to do this without comment. which she appreciated. They were disciplined soldiers, respectful in the manner of men who took their cues from their commander, and their commander had apparently indicated, through whatever wordless authority he operated with, that she was to be treated as someone whose presence was consequential. She noticed Tristan watching her work, sometimes. Not intrusively. He was never intrusive. But from a distance, at the edge of the firelight, with an expression that was difficult to read and that she was not yet ready to try. She was not ready for many things. On the 4th day of travel, it rained. A cold and serious autumn rain that turned the road to mud and reduced visibility to the tree line. They stopped at a way station, a low stone building maintained for travelers on the Clara road, with a common room and a hearth large enough to warm wet wool and a smell of damp stone and old smoke that was somehow deeply comforting. It was there, crowded around the hearth with Aldrich and 2 of Tristan's senior guards while rain hammered the shuttered windows, that she heard the news. A merchant coming from the north brought it, the way merchants always brought news, casually, as part of a longer complaint about road conditions. He had passed through the village nearest to Voss Keep 2 days prior. He mentioned, in the manner of a man who did not understand the weight of what he was saying, that the Lord of Voss Keep had sent riders in every direction after the disappearance of his new wife, and that the story being circulated was that she had lost her mind in the night, overcome by omega instability, and had wandered into the forest in a fugue state. Clara set down the document she had been reading. Omega instability. She recognized the phrase. It was the specific language used in the old northern statutes to declare an omega legally incompetent, to strip her of the right to testify, to sign documents, to hold property. If Edmund could establish that diagnosis before she reached the High Crown Council, her testimony could be challenged on procedural grounds before she ever opened her mouth. She was on her feet before she had finished the thought, crossing the common room toward the corner where Tristan sat apart from the others, reviewing his own documents with a candle burning close. She told him what she had heard. She did not dress it up or soften it. She watched him process it. The brief stillness, the slight shift in the set of his jaw. He is moving faster than I anticipated, Tristan said. He looked up at her. He must have discovered you were not simply wandering. Someone told him you were seen on the road east. Can he make the diagnosis stick? Not without a healer's formal examination and the signature of 2 council witnesses. He paused. But if he reaches Caerath before us, he can file the petition in advance and force a procedural hearing before the main council session. That would delay your testimony by days, possibly longer, while the petition is reviewed. Clara thought. The rain against the shutters was very loud. Then we need to arrive before him. The direct road adds a day. There is a shorter route through the Greyvale Pass. It cuts 2 days off the journey, but it is rough terrain, and the weather makes it harder. I can ride it. He looked at her steadily. She had learned over 4 days that this was how he assessed things, not by asking repeated questions or expressing doubt, but by looking, carefully, until he had seen what he needed. Yes, he said after a moment. I believe you can. They left the way station at first light. The Greyvale Pass was everything the name implied. Narrow, rocky, climbing sharply through terrain that the rain had made treacherous with loose stone and sudden drops in temperature. Clara rode without complaint. Her body had largely cleared the remnants of Edmund's herbs by now, and she discovered, somewhat grimly, that her constitution underneath the weeks of fog was considerably more capable than she had been allowed to remember. She had grown up on the edge of the Coldmere Valley, riding in worse weather than this, and her muscles remembered it even when her mind had half forgotten. Tristan rode beside her through the narrowest sections, close enough to intervene if her horse stumbled, far enough to give her independence. He did not offer help she had not asked for. He did not draw attention to the difficulty. He simply rode beside her in the wind and the cold and the wet, steadily, as though there was nowhere else he intended to be. On the second evening in the pass, they camped on a wide ledge sheltered by an overhang of granite. The horses tethered close for warmth, the fire built lower than usual against the wind. Clara sat wrapped in her cloak and the now familiar weight of Tristan's fur mantle. He had placed it around her shoulders without comment when he saw her shivering, and she had not given it back. Going through the last of the evidence documents by firelight, making marks in the margins with a piece of charcoal Aldrich had found for her. Tristan came and sat beside her. Not across from her, as he usually did, but beside her. Close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against the cold wind. She did not move away. "You grew up in Coldmere Valley," he said, not a question. "Until I was 14. Then my father's debts reached a point where we had to dismiss most of the household. We moved to a smaller holding." She kept her eyes on the document. "He died 3 years ago. The valley passed to me. But I had no means to maintain it alone, and no pack to support the territory. Edmund's offer came through an intermediary. It seemed..." She stopped. "It seemed like a solution," Tristan said without judgment. "It seemed like the only option available to an Omega without a wolf in a world that has very few places for women like that." She said it flatly, not with self-pity, but with the precision of someone naming a fact they have examined from every angle. "I was not naive. I understood it was a practical arrangement. I simply did not understand how thoroughly practical he intended it to be." The fire popped. Wind moved through the pass overhead like a long exhale. "You will have the valley back," Tristan said. "After Carath. Whatever Voss claimed through the marriage contract is void if the contract is dissolved on grounds of fraud. The land reverts." She turned to look at him. In the firelight, his profile was all dark lines, and that particular quality of stillness that she had come to associate specifically with him. Not coldness, not distance, but the stillness of something with a great deal of force, held carefully in check. "You researched the legal mechanism," she said, "before I came to the forest that night." "Yes." She stared at him. "You were already planning to help me." "I was planning to help whoever he had married next." He turned to meet her eyes. "It happened to be you." Something about that, the plainness of it, the absence of performance, reached her in a place she had been carefully keeping closed. She looked away first, back at the documents, and was quiet for a moment while she rebuilt the wall to a functional height. "Tristan." She said his name deliberately for the first time, and felt him go still beside her. "What you told me in the tent. About your wolf recognizing me." She kept her eyes on the charcoal marks in the margins. "I need you to understand that I have spent my entire life being defined by an absence. The absence of my wolf. The absence of a bond. The absence of a pack. I have been told that absence makes me lesser, makes me unstable, makes me someone who needs to be managed." She paused. "I will not enter into anything, based on a pull I do not yet understand, while I am still sleeping in borrowed cloaks and planning legal arguments and trying to remember who I am underneath 5 weeks of someone else's poison." The silence afterward was complete except for the wind. "I know," he said. His voice was the same as it always was, steady, low, without demand. "I told you because you deserve to know, not because I am asking you for anything." A pause. "I am not Edmund Voss. I will not ask you for anything you are not ready to give." She nodded once, her throat tight. "Sleep," he said, rising. "I will take the first watch." He moved away to the edge of the overhang and stood looking out at the dark pass, his back to her, giving her the fire and the quiet and the space to feel whatever she needed to feel without an audience. She sat beside the flames for a long time before she slept. And what she felt, underneath the exhaustion and the anger and the grief for a woman named Isolde she had never met, underneath all of it, like something surfacing slowly from very deep water, was the first faint warmth of something she was not ready to name. But she did not run from it. That, she thought, was already different. Kyrath was everything the northern villages were not. It rose from the plain like something that had always existed and simply waited for the rest of the world to catch up. Massive gray stone walls, towers that caught the morning light and held it. The banners of a dozen noble houses snapping in the wind above the gatehouse. The city inside the walls smelled of bread and iron and horse and wood smoke from 1,000 hearths, and the streets were loud with the commerce of a seat of power that never fully slept. They arrived on the 9th day of travel, 2 full days before the High Crown Council was scheduled to convene. Edmund had not yet reached the city. Tristan's outriders confirmed it within an hour of their arrival. No riders bearing the Voss sigil had passed through the eastern gates, and no petition had yet been filed with the council registry. They had beaten him. Not by much, but enough. Tristan kept a permanent residence in Carath, a stone house near the council quarter, large and spare and meticulously maintained by a small household staff, who greeted his arrival with the efficient calm of people long accustomed to their lord, appearing without warning. Clara was given a chamber on the upper floor, with a real bed, and a fire already laid, and a copper basin of hot water that she stood over for a long time with her eyes closed, feeling the steam against her face. She slept for 14 hours. When she woke, she felt like herself. Fully, completely, in a way she had almost forgotten was possible. Her mind clear, her body her own again. The last residue of Edmund's slow poison finally, thoroughly gone. She lay in the unfamiliar bed and took inventory of herself the way Maren had taught her over the past days, checking for fog, for heaviness, for the subtle wrongness that had been her baseline for so long she had stopped recognizing it as wrong. There was nothing, only clarity, and the particular energy of someone who has a great deal left to do. She rose and dressed, and went to find Aldrich. They spent the entire day in Tristan's map room, a long chamber on the ground floor, lined with shelves of bound records and rolled documents and the accumulated cartographic history of the northern reaches. They laid everything out on the central table, every land record, every transaction document, every sworn statement from Voss's former servants. Clara organized it with the systematic focus of someone who had decided that grief and anger were tools to be directed rather than weights to be carried, and Aldrich worked beside her with the grim dedication of a man who had waited 2 years for this moment. Tristan came and went throughout the day, bringing new information as his people gathered it. The names of the council allies Voss had cultivated, the precise legal statutes governing marriage contract fraud, the procedural rules for emergency testimony. He did not try to manage the organization of the evidence. He provided what was needed and left her to build it. She noticed this. She had come to notice many things about the way he operated, and each one sat in her chest alongside the others, accumulating weight. On the second morning, Edmund Voss arrived in Carath. He came with 6 riders and a council advocate, a sharp-faced man in dark robes who filed the Omega instability petition within the hour of their arrival. Clara heard about it from one of Tristan's household staff before the ink was dry on the filing. She put on her cleanest dress. She braided her pale hair with care, the way her mother had taught her, neat and smooth and deliberately composed. She walked to the council registry with Aldrich at her side and Tristan 2 paces behind, and she filed a counterpetition before the instability hearing could be scheduled. A formal request for immediate dissolution of the marriage contract on grounds of documented fraud, with evidence of deliberate poisoning and a sworn deposition from a serving commander of the Ashvale territories attesting to a pattern of criminal behavior. She also filed, separately, a request that the Alpha King of Ashvale be recognized as a material witness. The registry clerk looked up from the documents with an expression that suggested he had not had a morning like this in some time. "All in order," he said, after a long pause. The instability petition died in procedural review before it was ever heard. Edmund's advocate attempted to argue that the counterpetition was improperly filed, that Clara lacked standing without a pack affiliation, that the Ashvale testimony was outside the council's jurisdiction. The reviewing magistrate, a thin, dry woman of considerable experience, who had the air of someone who had heard every argument at least twice and was not impressed by any of them, dismissed each objection in turn with the efficiency of someone clearing a table. The full hearing was set for the following morning. Clara did not sleep much that night. She sat by the fire in her chamber at Tristan's residence and went through her testimony one more time, not because she had forgotten it, but because the act of moving through it helped her hold the shape of what she intended. She was not afraid of speaking. She had never been afraid of that. She was afraid of the particular cruelty of being disbelieved in a room full of people with the power to decide her life, and she intended to make that outcome as structurally impossible as she could. There was a knock at her chamber door near midnight. She knew who it was before she answered. Tristan stood in the corridor with 2 cups and a small clay pot of something hot. He lifted them slightly in a wordless question. She stepped back and let him in. They sat by the fire as they had sat by so many fires over the past 11 days, and he poured the hot drink, a simple spiced cider, tart and warm. And they were quiet for a while in the comfortable way that had developed between them on the road, a silence that did not require filling. "Are you ready?" he asked finally. "Yes." She held the cup in both hands and looked at the fire. "I have been ready since the corridor at Voss Keep. I just needed the room and the evidence to match what I already knew." He was quiet for a moment. "After tomorrow," he said, "the valley will be yours again. The Northern Territory holdings will revert by law within 30 days of the council ruling. You will have your father's land back." "I know." She paused. "I keep thinking about what to do with it. I was so focused on surviving and fighting that I had not let myself think past the fight." She almost smiled, not quite. "It is a strange feeling. A good one, I think." "Yes." She turned to look at him. In the firelight, his face was familiar now, in a way it had not been 12 days ago, and she recognized the shift for what it was, the slow accumulation of trust, of time, of being seen accurately by someone and not found wanting. "I have been thinking about what you said. In the past." He did not pretend not to know what she meant. He simply waited. "I still do not fully understand what I feel," she said honestly. "I have spent so long being told what I am and what I am not that I am not entirely sure yet which parts of myself I am rediscovering and which parts are new. I do not want to make another decision about my own life from a place of need or fear or gratitude." She met his pale eyes steadily. "But I am not afraid of this, of you, and I want you to know that I noticed the difference." Something moved across his face, deep and quiet and entirely real. The expression of a man who had not allowed himself to want something and was only now beginning to believe it might be possible. "That is enough," he said. "That is more than enough." She nodded once and looked back at the fire, and they finished their cider in the comfortable silence of 2 people who understood that some things did not need to be rushed. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Clara spoke for most of the first one. She stood before the High Crown Council. 7 magistrates in formal robes, representatives of every major noble house in the northern reaches, and a gallery of observers that included Edmund Voss sitting rigid with his advocate beside him, and she delivered her testimony without trembling, without hesitation, without the kind of performed emotion that could be dismissed as instability. She was precise. She was documented. She named every transaction, every date, every woman. She said Isolde's name aloud in that chamber and made the council record it. Aldrich testified after her. His voice broke once, when he described finding his sister's letters, and he did not apologize for it. Tristan testified last. He spoke for 20 minutes in the measured, authoritative manner of a man before whom counsels did not posture, and he presented the full 6 months of investigative documentation, with the calm of someone who had been building toward this moment with great patience and intended to see it completed. Edmund's advocate made 4 arguments. The magistrate dismissed 3 before he finished stating them, and reviewed the 4th for 11 minutes before dismissing it as well. The ruling took less than an hour to deliver. The marriage contract was dissolved on grounds of fraud and criminal intent. Edmund Voss was remanded to council custody pending a full criminal trial for the deaths of Isolde and the 2 women before her, whose names were read into the record for the first time in any official proceeding. The Coldmere Valley was returned to Clara Ashford in full, with a formal council apology for the failure of the regional body to act on the initial complaint 2 years prior. The 2 council lords who had protected Voss were suspended from their seats pending investigation. The High Steward resigned before the session closed. Clara stood in the council chamber afterward, while the gallery emptied around her, and held the official dissolution document in her hands. The parchment was heavy. The council seal at the bottom was pressed deep into the wax, dark red and definitive. She read it twice, not because she needed to, but because it was real, and she wanted to feel the reality of it settle. Aldrich found her first. He did not say anything. He simply put his hand briefly on her shoulder, and she covered it with her own for a moment, and that was sufficient. Tristan waited until she was ready, as he always did. She returned to the Coldmere Valley in the first week of winter. The valley was cold and quiet, and the old holding house needed work. The roof in the east wing had partially collapsed during the years of vacancy, and the grounds had gone wild in the way of land that has been left to its own judgment. She stood in the overgrown courtyard on the first morning and looked at all of it, and felt, beneath the enormity of the task ahead, a bone-deep rightness. This was hers. This had always been hers, and she was back. Tristan came with her. She had asked him to, in the quiet way she was learning to ask for things she wanted, directly, without apology, without dressing the asking up as something else. He had said yes in the equally quiet way he said most things, and he had brought 6 of his men and Maren and Aldrich, and they had traveled the 3 days from Carath together, through the first light snowfall of the season. He stayed through the winter. It was not a sudden thing, the way it grew between them. It had not been sudden at any point. It was the accumulation of mornings, of him appearing with a cup of something hot when she was already up and working before dawn, of her saving him a place by the fire without thinking about it, of conversations that started about repairs and land records and winter supplies, and moved, naturally and without announcement, into everything else. It was the afternoon she found him in the old library, going carefully through her father's books, and realized he had been quietly learning the history of the Coldmere family, because he wanted to understand the place that had made her. It was the evening she cried properly for the first time, not from despair, but from the complicated, overwhelming feeling of standing in a place she had thought was lost, and finding it still there. And he sat with her through it, without trying to fix it or reduce it, only present, his shoulder solid against hers. It was the morning in late winter when the first snowdrops pushed through the frost near the east wall, and she found him crouched down looking at them with the particular attention he gave to things he found genuinely remarkable. And she understood that she had been wrong about one thing, all those nights ago in Tristan's tent. She had called what she felt toward him unnamed. It had a name. She had simply been waiting until she trusted it fully. She stood beside him and looked at the snowdrops and told him so. He rose and turned to her, and took her face in his hands with the same gentleness he used for everything that mattered. And when he kissed her, it was warm and unhurried and certain. The kiss of someone who had waited without resentment, and now had no need to rush. She chose him with her full self, in her own time, on her own land, in the first light of a morning that smelled of cold earth and new growth. That was the difference. That was everything. Edmund Voss stood trial before the High Crown Council the following spring. He was convicted on 3 counts of deliberate harm resulting in death, 1 count of marriage fraud, and 2 counts of territorial theft. He was stripped of his lands and titles and remanded to the Crown's custody for the remainder of his days. His 2 council allies were removed permanently from their seats and their holdings placed under Crown administration. The High Steward's resignation was accepted, and the vacancy was filled by a woman from the Eastern Territories who had spent 15 years arguing for stronger protections for Omega landholders. Aldrich was present for the sentencing. He stood straight and dry-eyed through all of it. And when it was over, he went to visit his sister's grave in the village near Voss Keep, and he left flowers there, and he said her name, and he came home. Clara Ashford, she never took another man's name, was formally recognized by the High Crown Council as the sole and sovereign holder of the Coldmere Valley and its associated territories. The recognition ceremony was brief and procedural, as she had requested, without fanfare. She signed the documents in the council chamber where she had first stood and spoken the truth aloud, and the seal pressed into the wax was the same dark red. And this time it did not just feel real. It felt right. Tristan stood beside her. Not in front of her, not behind her. Beside her, as he had been since a cold night in a forest when she had opened her eyes and found him across a fire and felt, for reasons she could not yet name, that she was not afraid. She was not afraid now either. She was not the woman who had arrived at Voss Keep with 2 trunks and a fragile, borrowed hope. She was not the woman who had woken poisoned in a forest, or the woman who had shaken in a corridor listening to the sound of her own life being calculated. She was Clara Ashford of Coldmere Valley, and she had her land and her name and her voice and the truth on record in the highest court in the northern reaches, and she had a man beside her who had never once asked her to be less than she was. She had everything she had come from, and everything she had fought for, and everything she had chosen. That was enough. That was more than enough.